Sure. I mean, it's no short conversation. I've been in private equity for 20 years, and I kind of entered the field with some pretty well-formed ideas about how I felt, industrial or commercial or entrepreneurial life should be organized, or might be organized with the hope of good outcome. And there are quite a few strands to it. I mean, I think the starting point for me would probably be epistemological, right? I look at the world and I say, okay, complex stories can't be resolved by deductive and inductive means. You must go through a process of trial and error because you can't predict consequences. You have to test things on the margins in small bites, in non-fragile ways. In other words, in ways that don't entail the possibility of existential collapse. So you want to do things in a trial and error, conjecture and criticism fashion. The other word for that is evolutionary fashion. And I'm not referring then, of course, to only biological evolution. Everything that's complex progresses by way of evolution, and by evolution only. There is no other way of progress. And so I then take that insight and apply it to endless aspects of commercial life. For example, strategy creation for me is not something done by the CEO in PowerPoint and explainable to a handful of investors on the way down the elevator. That's a complete illusion or delusion. Strategy is formed by having lots of different ideas about how to deal with the complexity of any company in its commercial ecosystem. And every company's commercial ecosystem is complex. There aren't simple companies. There's no such thing. So if you are trying to create value as opposed to just eke out a living, you have to grapple with complexity. And I think when it comes to strategy, the way to do that is by having lots of small ideas being tested all the time, and a business culture of quickly paring away the ones that don't and quickly investing behind the ones that do work. So that's how it works out according to strategy. Then the other thing is people derive a sense of meaning and purpose in life from ownership in a particular domain. It doesn't have to be represented by a share certificate or a title deed, but there needs to be some genuine personal connection in ownership in that sense to the things you busy yourself with on a daily basis. Otherwise, you get to this kind of sense of atomized pointlessness in life, which so besets people in the corporate world these days. It's been written about many times, including very, very comically in comic strips like Dilbert and that kind of thing. And so the way I interpret that is the executives of a business need to have real skin in the game. They need to have downside and upside exposure. That's best articulated by way of fairly unfettered stock ownership. So I don't have bad and good lever provisions or attempts to inject into the mix some kind of performance review for a CEO on an annual basis. I think that's an absurd idea. The way listed companies have their remuneration committees kind of giving the CEO a school report at the end of the year is, I find it like bizarrely immature and inhumane. So I only invest alongside management teams who are committing substantial money to their ventures, substantial relative to their balance sheets, not necessarily to mine or to my funds. And that's a core thing. It was, a centerpiece of private equity worldwide if you went back 20 or 30 years ago. But that principle is now mostly honored in the breach. So that's the second one. And then the third one, the third big thing is, with the advent of stakeholder governance, has come along a great deal of confusion around what's good and bad for businesses. Most of the things that are categorized as best practice are actually terrible practice. The whole stakeholder capitalism story comes with this vague idea that there are multiple stakeholders that have to be satisfied at the same time, and yet no coherent framework is provided for trading off the interests of one stakeholder against another. And of course, in the absence of that theory, the stakeholder capitalism is a completely meaningless and foolish, deeply, deeply foolish theory, come up with by a terribly stupid man called Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. But yeah, one of the intellectual terrorists of the 20th century, and unfortunately living long enough to make him one of the 21st too. But yeah, these ideas about how to fracture prioritization and somehow satisfy multiple stakeholders are completely foolish. And of course, what they basically come down to is cover for the implementation of all sorts of ideological aspirations, which have nothing to do with human flourishing and everything to do with control over other human beings. So it's an ethically and morally pernicious framework.
Yes, and there you touched on and you really put your finger on, like, when I say you're a crusader, because and here I'm not putting words in your mouth, but your ability to go in and quickly see, and the phrase that caught me was cooperative. Oh shoot, now it's flown my mind. The assumptions, cooperative assumptions or collective assumptions within a company. You said in the other interview, you can recognize this very quickly. Like, these people assume that this is true, and they assume that other people in the company think that this is true, right? How did we get to, I guess the question here is, how did we get to a place? There's a kind of inversion going on. Like, stakeholder capitalism is good. Like, what's bad for the company, I mean, at the bottom line, is good. Democracy is, like, we are in a kind of Orwellian doublespeak kind of reality across a broad spectrum of institutions. I would venture to say, with very few exceptions, all institutions now operate in this very upside down world where what's good is bad, freedom is slavery, right down the line. I mean, Orwell really nailed it on a lot of levels, and you're actually seeing this at the corporate level.
Yeah.
The average Joe Sixpack, and I don't want to be insulting to Joe Sixpack here, but the average person in the U.S. has come to associate capitalism with something bad, right? Everything has been inverted to a point where, like, how do you get out of a mire where people's thinking is not just wrong, it's not just muddled, it's not just confused, it's actually inverted. You talked about centralization vis-a-vis decentralization, corporatism versus capitalism, right? Talk to the audience, like, explain to people what you've discovered, both from your work, but also as a good critical thinker, about what has happened, why it's happened, how you're navigating that in your private equity company, and what you've learned from it, or, what people can discern from what is taking place in the sort of modern zeitgeist of this great inversion.
Sure. I mean, it actually starts with that point we reached just now about the only way forward in the face of complexity being the repeated application of the process of conjecture and criticism, and that is the starting point. That process can only take place under conditions of freedom, and the reason for that is, conjecture entails multiple theories about how the world ought to be organized and how problems ought to be addressed. And criticism of those ideas also requires freedom. If you have one monolithic idea running society and a government inhibiting free speech to prevent people from criticizing the state, then what you are doing at the same time necessarily is shutting off the avenues for conjecture and criticism. So conjecture and criticism, being the only method that can be used to solve complex problems, requires conditions of freedom. One of the conditions of freedom is freedom to buy and sell. So that is free markets are a subset of freedom in general. And that entails a kind of decentralized capitalism, if you like, where ownership of ownership rights are respected, that you can eat your own cooking and reap what you sow. I would say, perhaps you could say that a second principle has been added to the world, sort of that there should be consequences to people's actions and that people should be able to eat their own cooking. That's an ethical stance, and I can add that to the observation that free markets are one of the things required in order to solve problems. And then so you've got to decentralize capitalism as kind of a cornerstone of progress and human flourishing. Where people get stuck is they have been talked into believing that it is somehow an inevitable consequence of the adoption of free markets that you will end up in the kind of situation we have ended up in now, namely a situation where concentration of market control has become extreme, and we have oligarchs amassing immense fortunes at the expense of the poor and middle classes. But I don't think that that is at all representative of the capacity and potential of capitalism. This situation, this oligarchic representation that we've got at the moment, required something completely different from freedom. It required actually the freedom's opposite. When governments began to get bigger and bigger in Western countries, what inevitably happened was that they became every large corporation's largest customer. And the moment that happened, the incentives for those large companies to lobby those governments and secure public favor, I mean state favor, that sense of public, for those companies became, irresistible. And so you have entire industries built up around lobbying government on behalf of large corporate interests. And so
That
what we've
is
ended up with is not a capitalist world, but a corporatist world. That's one of the elements of fascism. So people are actually, when they take aim at what they call capitalism, what they're thinking of is actually fascism. And their critique is that, oh, well, this is the product of free markets. No, it's not. It's the product of large states. Corporatism is the product of having a large government.
that is the US system. Whether
Yeah.
it's defense contractors or my family owns a home on the Virginia side of DC. And my father worked in Crystal City, Roslyn, right? This is the area where, right, big defense contract, you get out of the military, you go to work for a private defense contractor, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know that from speaking to him, I know that world somewhat, right, with some intimacy because I've seen it, right? I saw where he worked. You go down to Crystal City and Roslyn and these areas where these defense contractors work, and every single one of them has a big lobbying office on K Street or whatever it is, so they can be close to the seat of power, so they can go do their briefings and their presentations about why we need. I mean, there's a hilarious joke. I haven't been back to DC in a long time, but if you ride the metro in DC, the public transport in and out of the city, which is quite nice. I mean, it works and whatever else, but you'll see posters inside the subway. I'm not making this up. And it's an advertisement for an F-22 or something like this, right? Where it's like, so let me get this straight. Like a soccer mom from Reston, Virginia is buying an F-22. Like, who are you advertising this to? Like, that's how deep the propaganda goes, that you're supposed to somehow be
Yeah.
on board with the idea that, like, no, we need a marketing arm to make sure that, right, that our and so this people use the term fascism to mean authoritarianism, right? This is one of the great, right, doublespeak misrepresentations of verbiage, but you've just defined it in the way that I always understood it and the way that I think it is best understood. All governments are authoritarian. If they weren't, they wouldn't be the government. So that's a weird redundancy to use fascism as authoritarian. Like Trump is a
Yeah.
fascist or whatever. It's like, no, all governments are authoritarian. And I would also argue that almost all governments at this stage of the game in history are also corporatist. In other words, the original
Yes.
definition of fascism, that is the power of the state and the power of corporations working hand in glove to try to maintain the flow of money and the sucking off of wealth from taxpayers and the tax base to try to maintain their hold on power. And so in many ways, this is a natural relationship. I mean, the government has
Yeah.
the power to use violence against people with total legal impunity. The companies and corporations that maintain control over the population, whether it's Silicon Valley surveillance, arm of the government. That is a corporatist kind of relationship where these people do one thing and the government says, thank you very much, and we'll give you special privileges and you can make insane amounts of money and you'll benefit from this. All the way down to, as I said, weapons manufacturers, hawking their wares inside the DC Metro to whatever passengers are in the market for an F-22. So clarity over speech, again, like it comes, clear thinking partly results from understanding like clear definitions of words. When you hear a hyperventilating blue-haired lesbian screaming about fascism, it's like, but you don't actually know what you're not actually using that word in a way that's actually beneficial to any kind of discourse, which of course is partly the point, right? They want to hyperventilate, they want to be upset about stuff.
Yeah.
But
yeah, the other point is that they pretty much don't know anything. They've just had their heads filled with drivel
and proud of it. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. But so I mean, yes, I think what's interesting about the current moment is that we see this fascism, the combination of government and large corporates acting in concert, beginning to play out on the global level. So we can call it global fascism or global fascism, as some commentators refer to it. And I think that is the surface level perception that we can make pretty firmly and without too much quibbling. And then it becomes interesting. Well, how did this come about? It hasn't always been thus. Is it a product of technology, or is there something interesting about our times that is giving rise to this kind of phenomenon? And there I'm in two minds. I think it's probably both. You know, it seems to me that in the declining stages of empire, it's correct to see that the linear thinkers, the bureaucratic thinkers, the people who do believe that problems can be solved with spreadsheets and protocols and algorithms, in other words, by deduction and induction, such people are ascendant in the world. The bureaucrats rise. Their mandarinates, their bureaucracies become a larger portion of the economy, and they become this kind of great parasitic mass eating away at the soul of a culture or country. And I think we're at that waning phase in what we might loosely refer to as the Western Empire. That in prior eras, the government was much smaller. You only have to go back about 110, 120 years to find that the government in most Western countries represented less than 10% of the economy. And in those eras, I think the builders, the creators, the designers, the entrepreneurs were the ascendant men in the societies. They were the heroes of the time. And the bureaucrats were regarded favorably, if you like, but as civil servants, as people who chose a more stable life of service for which they were modestly recompensed,
as opposed to reality
of risk.
Yes, as opposed to reality TV stars.
Yes,
which is what it has
exactly.
become. And not just Trump, right? There's a ton of people who garner a ton of airtime and have a kind of celebrity, right, cachet, and they put out a sort of image that they have to maintain. The rise of government by Twitter, right, is a very strange phenomenon to live through. It's like, what do you mean you're putting out a policy point or decision, right, based on social media? Like what is going on here, right? The whole thing has been Hollywoodized, right, for lack of any better term. But
absolutely. I mean, I think democracy is a complete illusion at the moment, and possibly has been for many, many decades. If it ever was anything other than an illusion, in fact. But it seems pretty clear that the politicians who are on our screens and who appear in our social media feeds are almost all actors of one sort or another, and they don't have any real power. And the aspects of them and their policies that we get to see are the curated products of a highly controlled media and social media complex. Um, and the kind of false choice you're presented with when you vote isn't a choice with respect to anything important at all. It's all just this surface level stuff that we're taught to care greatly about, and that we're encouraged to polarize our societies around, is actually, for the most part, irrelevant. A great
Well,
example of that is the whole trans debate, trans sentiments or afflictions affected an incredibly small portion of people prior to what, to choose a year, 2020
2020,
to
more or
sorry,
less. Yeah.
2000, whatever,
Yeah.
sometime in the last generation, it sort of changed. But this discussion around trans has been used as a distractive mechanism to polarize people. I mean, I think pretty simple from an analytical perspective. It's ridiculous to uh, credit a person with knowing what it's like to be something they aren't. If I said to you, Tain, I know what it's like to be a dog, you would say you're crazy. Of course you don't. And so if I then followed it up with, and I identify as a dog, you'd then think I'm really crazy. And for some reason or other, people have forgotten that. And so when a man walks into the room and says, I know what it's like to be a woman and I identify as a woman, they don't say he's crazy. Of course, what normally happens these days is the first part, the I know what it's like to be a woman, is left out. They just go straight to I identify as a woman. And of course, I mean, it's no less crazy than me claiming to know what it's like to be a dog. But somehow that sort of injection of that one crazy idea, and the successful bifurcation of camps has led to this incredibly distractive event. I mean, you can point to all sorts of precepts in conventional morality and tradition that are violated by that idea. But when you really look at it, it's a sideshow compared to the massive forces that are shaping and affecting people's lives to their detriment at the moment. And the more of those sideshows there are, the more Ukrainian-Russian conflicts and Israel-Gaza conflicts and trans and whatever, vax, anti-vax, you name it. The more of those conflicts there are, the less focus is brought upon the really big issues of our times.